Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV channel. You can watch us 24/7 on Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, as well as on muslimnetwork.tv. Today, our show will be centered around Guantanamo. As many of you know, that this prison is it has been a stain on America's back for several years. And today we have with us Mobasher Tazamal. She has been a guest with us before as well. And she's a senior research fellow at the Bridge Initiative, and who's working on who works on research projects, especially centering on Islamophobia at Georgetown University. And so today's entire show is centered around Bridge Initiative's latest project, which provides a comprehensive picture of the prison, centering the lives of the boys and men detained at this naval base. Now, a lot of times we hear about the prison and we hear about many of the horrific things that happen over there, but we don't know, a lot of times, we don't know who these young men and these boys, these men were, what were their lives like, who were their families, and where did they come from? I have often wondered, what were are their mothers feeling? I have two boys, and God forbid, this is reality for a lot of families around the world. So this project seeks to highlight their trauma and really give us a sense of who these people were. Just some highlights that I'm sure Mobasher is going to share much more with us, that there were 780 Muslim boys and men who were detained in Guantanamo. 780 families were affected. And they came from 72 countries, mostly from Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. So let's bring Mobasher on so she can tell us more about this project. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me. Just to begin with, so the idea behind the Guantanamo Data Project was, so January, we just passed it, was 19 years of Guantanamo. We are approaching 2 decades. There are still 40 individuals who remain at the prison. And during our research, we couldn't find, a central source which gave us how many men are there, how many have left, how many were charged, what countries they came from. So it was actually one of our brilliant Bridge interns, Emily Saranovich, who started gathering this information using the Guantanamo docket. It's on the New York Times. So we went through each entry. So there's 780 in total. We went through each entry. And mind you, we only had access to government documents. Guantanamo is there's no information. It's not transparent. And the information that we have is from the government, and it's very limited. So we looked at it. It's called the Joint Task Force, and it was basically a biographical and a historical overview of each individual, where they were when they were caught, what date they were caught, when they arrived at Guantanamo, if they had been released, what date they were released, their age, if they were suffering from any mental illnesses. And then, we read their stories about how they were kidnapped. And later on, if you look online, there have been reports that many of these men were sold for a bounty. They were fundamentally just picked up. There were stories of men and boys. So we want to highlight that there were minors. Some of the youngest were 15. Children picked up from their homes. There was one story I remember reading of one individual who actually went to the American soldiers in Afghanistan and told them that there was a possible bomb explosion nearby. He warned them, he told them. And for that, he was actually picked up and sent to Guantanamo. he actually told them of a dangerous thing that was happening, and they picked him up. And I think one of the stories that'll stick with me from what I read is one of the oldest detainees was 89. He was an Afghan man, 89, picked up, flown halfway across the world to essentially a concentration camp. And there he spent about 5 months before he was, before they said, oh, well, why do we have him here? But the trauma of that, we can't underscore that, and the trauma that their families went through, their communities went through, and there's been no accountability. There's been um, no recognition of what this prison has done to millions of individuals around the world.
So tell us more about, so what are we seeing over here?
So these were the countries where the men, their nationalities, where they came from. As you mentioned, there's over 70 countries. The primary top three were Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. So if you highlight it, you can see much of the globe was in Guantanamo. These men came from all different backgrounds. I know in the news right now we're talking a lot about, and there's rightful attention being given to the Uyghur genocide. There were Uyghurs in Guantanamo. There were Rohingya in Guantanamo. There's actually one of them has just been cleared for release, and he's a stateless Rohingya. So we wanted to highlight that this didn't just affect individuals from one country. They affected the majority of the globe. These are stories that are everywhere. And then another thing we wanted to highlight was not only where the country of origin, but where they were repatriated to. Meaning, so when the military at Guantanamo decided, oh, we should release this person, some of the times they were not sent to their country of origin. They were sent to a third country. We found that nearly 22% of the detainees at Guantanamo upon their release were not sent to their country of origin. And this is really important to note because oftentimes they were sent to countries where they knew no one, they did not know the language. Most of the times they don't have access to their passport. So there have been stories of prisoners who've been released saying like they've just ended up in another Guantanamo because they're in a completely foreign place with no connections. And many of the former detainees have noted, Guantanamo stays with you forever. It's not something that as soon as you're released, that it just disappears. It's with them forever. It's part of their story. And even now there is Mohamedou Salahi. He was in Guantanamo for, I believe, over 10 years. He wrote the book, The Guantanamo Diaries, which is now become a movie, The Mauritanian. He still is trying to, get access to his passport to go and be with his wife and his newborn child. So Guantanamo still affects these individuals even after they've been released.
Really, when we think about them and the fact that they were not charged for years and years and years, and when they were, the charges against them, if they were ever charged, some of them, could you give us a little bit of background
Yeah.
just on that, on what new things did you discover? Because a lot of times this information is out there, but to collate it together and look at trends and patterns, that's what you all have done here.
Absolutely. So wanted to highlight, so right now there are still 40 individuals that remain at Guantanamo. 6 of them have been cleared for release. 22 of them are forever prisoners. That means they haven't been charged with anything. They are held under this indefinite law of war detention. They're kind of stuck in this legal black hole. Guantanamo essentially is like legal outer space. Under President Bush, he set up Guantanamo and they created this enemy combatant kind of title. And basically that denied these individuals their fundamental human rights, their protections from the Geneva Conventions. So only 7 have been charged in the military commissions. Only two have been convicted, but they're still awaiting sentencing. So they haven't technically been sentenced.
Mm-hmm.
So over 98% of the individuals, the Muslim boys and men who were in Guantanamo, were never charged, and they spent decades in this prison. You know, that is time that you will never get back. That is time completely lost. They had children that were born that they haven't touched. There was a recent open letter by Ahmed Rabbani. He's one of these so-called forever prisoners, and he wrote that he hasn't seen his children. He hasn't seen his family over, I believe he's been there for over 16 years. It's going to be almost 3,000 days since he's been on a hunger strike in protest of his detention. And the irony of this whole story is that he was caught under the assumption that he was this wanted person named Hassan Gol or something.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. actually caught the person they wanted to catch,
Mm-hmm.
and they released him for being cooperative. Ahmed Rabbani, it's a case of misidentification, false identification, is still sitting in Guantanamo. Why? You know, and he's ever since with the new administration, the Biden administration, he in his open letter has called on Biden to, you know, shut the prison down. A lot of former detainees have written an open letter calling on the new administration to shut this prison down once and for all. Over 100 organizations, including the ACLU, Amnesty, Center for Constitutional Rights, also signed an open letter saying, you know, it's well beyond time to shut this thing down.
Yeah. And this was a promise by the Obama administration. And how much does the prison cost the U.S. government?
So since it's opened in 2002, this has cost U.S. taxpayers $6 billion. Every year, it's about $380 million. That is taxpayer money being used to illegally detain individuals that have never been charged with a crime on an island in a legal black hole. That money could be going to healthcare, going to education, going to other things, but why is it being spent on violating Muslim men and boys' basic fundamental human rights? We really have to ask that question. What is the need for this?
And a bogeyman was created out of these young people.
Absolutely.
So, and to hear that so many of them were never charged with a crime. I mean, this is something that those of you who are listening or watching need to realize. This is that is the crux of the issue. Like, if this was if they had been gone through a process, they were charged with something, they were given, you know, they all had lawyers for, I mean, years, lawyers have been flying in and have not had access. And what did you learn about their relationships with what that they formed while living in Guantanamo?
So you had mentioned the lawyers, and I want to highlight, you know, a lot of their defense attorneys weren't able to, the CIA was spying on the lawyers while they were trying to communicate with their clients. You know, a complete violation of their rights. The government won't hand over documents, you know, that the defense lawyers need in the cases. But a lot of it, honestly, is rooted down into the torture that these men also endured. So when they were picked up in Afghanistan, they were oftentimes taken to black sites around the world. And these were secret, undercover, run by the CIA, where they endured just horrible, horrible torture, waterboarding, you know, sleep deprivation, stress positions, beatings, sexual assault. And then they were brought to Guantanamo, where much of that continued. And there's a whole report by Congress, the Senate report on torture. You know, the government calls it euphemistically enhanced interrogation, but it is torture. And many of these individuals went through that. So a lot of the so-called evidence the government is claiming they have was coerced under torture. And that's why defense attorneys have said, you know, we shouldn't be able to use this because it was taken under torture, which has been proven. It doesn't actually provide you any evidence. And I want to highlight one of the things we looked at was the torture program itself. And we also I mentioned we looked at, how many detainees were reported as suffering from some sort of mental illness. It's important to note that the torture program was created by two psychologists. So health professionals were involved, whose basic morals and ethics are to protect and save human lives, were involved in creating this torture program. They were given millions of dollars by the U.S. government to create this program. They provided interrogators at the black sites, and they created the torture methods, the waterboarding. And early last year, during one of their pre-trial hearings, which I can tell you, we're still in pre-trial stages, 19 years in. One of the psychologists, James Mitchell, I believe, he testified, and he defended himself, and he said he would still do it again if he had to. So there's no remorse, there's no recognition.
It's that whole dehumanization of Muslim bodies through this war on terror. It all comes down to that we're not considered as human as, and especially those Muslims who are in in countries that have been on the receiving end of our bombs, as American bombs. Those are especially, and it's a living example. I feel like. Just to make the American public scared of.
Yes. And Guantanamo is the result of state-sanctioned Islamophobia. We really wanted to drive that home, that Islamophobia underpins the existence of this military prison. These individuals were painted in the media as the worst of the worst, and the word terrorist was used. And like you said, it dehumanizes individuals. And terrorists, we know for the past at least 2 decades, has uniquely and only been applied to Muslims. And so when you use that term, you say that any sort of punishment, as you can say, is valid. There's no need for human rights. There's no need for due process. You are guilty because you are Muslim. That was essentially what it was, because they haven't been able to prove any of, over 98% were never charged with anything. And so that's one of the things that a lot of activists have been noting, is that we shut Guantanamo down, but we also need to tackle the foundations that let it exist. And that is tackling this framework that frames Muslims as terrorists. And that framework, as you know, Hena, and as you've covered on this show before, it's being used by other countries across the globe to criminalize Muslims.
Exactly. I remember several years ago when a sister of a young man who had been entrapped by the FBI, because it's the same system. The FBI entraps them in the United States, and overseas, we bring these young people over, or these young men over, and put them into Guantanamo. And she came up with this terminology of state-sponsored Islamophobia. And then I remember the Coalition to Protect Civil Liberties. Just so we've been seeing this for the past, as you say, 19 years. But the work on the activists who've been working on this have been working along with it for the past this many years. And it's taken this long to actually put that framework in place and get mainstream universities and others to accept it. So it delights me that Georgetown is doing this project. I couldn't have imagined this project 15 years ago. I could not have imagined Muslim organizations talking about Guantanamo 15 years ago, because the ones who did were shunned by the community. They were not, people were too scared. It was too new, too raw. Oh, we're the good Muslims. We don't talk about those bad Muslims over there. So this is a part, so I'm very excited that you guys have taken this step and actually studied them as human beings and highlighted their. So what I love hearing the stories that you are telling of and putting names behind. They're just not prisoners or, terrorists. They're human beings. So tell us some other point stories that you found during your research that just touched you.
When I was reading their names, they sound like, and their lives were like, people back home, my relatives back home in Pakistan. And the fact that I think some of the stories that really resonated me, especially for those who former detainees who have spoken out and people who are still detained, is their connection to their faith and how, really trusting in God and having that belief system to really help them through this horrible time period really was inspiring to me, but also to show us that, like, as a community, we should be doing more to be speaking out about this. Some of the stories, I just appreciated knowing their names. We often hear 40 men detained, or we often hear these individuals. The media often just says terrorists. So the fact that, Abdul Qudus, Naqibullah, Asadullah, these names we need to be saying, they're important. And I think one of the stories, and repeatedly we looked at as well, as I mentioned the torture stuff, and I think it's important that we also acknowledge the physical, psychological, emotional, and mental toll that this prison had on individuals, the waterboarding, the sleep deprivation, forced feeding. So thank you for mentioning that. I talked about how one of the Ahmed Rabbani, who's on a hunger strike. So there have been brief periods. I think there was one around 2012. There was hundreds of detainees took part in a mass, hunger strike because they were protesting their conditions. The government actually force-fed these individuals, and that is a complete violation of their human rights, complete violations of Geneva Conventions. The UN has spoken out about Guantanamo, and if you don't know what force feeding is, you can read some of these detainees have described, and it is painful. They would often, their lungs would bleed, they would throw up. And I want to highlight Ahmed Rabbani. Actually, he now weighs, this is a man, he weighs 80 pounds.
How many pounds?
He weighs 80 pounds.
Wow.
He has lost 53% of his body weight. And in his open letter, he said, 53% of me has escaped this prison. And that resonates with me, and that is painful, that is powerful. And he's also, in his open letter, he's a cook. So he cooks for his fellow detainees. So imagine someone who loves food, who loves to cook for other people, but he's not eating. And he wrote that, he said, imagine how that's torture for him as well. But it's the only way.
I wanted to show this picture of a detainee being force fed, and so a lot of people, when they hear the term force feeding, they think maybe it's a tube in their arm or just in that manner. But look at this; it's literally food being pumped up your nose.
So this was sorry, this was in, I think this was in 2012. This is actually Mos Def. Mm-hmm. He was trying to bring awareness to the force feeding. And so he publicly did this. And they tied him down exactly like they do to the individuals in Guantanamo. He has the orange jumpsuit. Mm-hmm. And they put this tube that goes all the way down and goes down. So it goes through your nose. And if you have the stomach for it, it is, I'm going to warn you, it is very, very graphic and painful, but this is what they went through for a long time. And there were, people speaking out about it, but the government, again, with Guantanamo, it seems as if the government and the CIA, FBI, everyone, they kind of have been doing what they've wanted to do. You have fantastic lawyers and fantastic organizations. You have activists who have consistently, for the past 2 decades, been raising awareness about this prison. One of the other things I wanted to mention when you had asked about, more stories is recently the New York Times actually announced Ibrahim Idris.
Mhm.
He was a Sudanese man who actually just passed away. He was the age of 60, and he passed away as consequences from the torture that he endured at Guantanamo. So I want to point out that many of these men, it's lifelong physical, mental, psychological effects from being there. And his story is very interesting because some of the early images that we have of Guantanamo, and I remember these, I was in middle school, I believe, is Camp X-Ray. That was one of the first camps. So there were numerous camps within Guantanamo. Some of them we never even knew about. Some of them we didn't know about until years later because again, you can't access Guantanamo. So Camp X-Ray was the first camp built. And some of the earliest images that we have are from this camp. So I don't know if you recall, is the individuals wearing, they have their eyes, they're blindfolded, they're handcuffed, they're kneeling on gravel, and you see guards there's wire fence around them. He was one of those individuals in that picture.
I remember there was one they're trying to kneel down to pray
Yes,
as well.
yes. He was one of those individuals, and he was held for, I believe, 11 years at Guantanamo. He was never charged. He always said he was innocent. And the fact that, he's 60 is not old. And he passed away from what happened in Guantanamo. So again, we wanted to highlight with this project, and we note this in the conclusion, is that Guantanamo one day hopefully will no longer exist, but we want to remember their stories, and we want people to know that this is something that physically may go away, but it will be within those former detainees. It'll be part of their lives, their families' lives, their communities' lives. A lot of these individuals came from villages, and we know how important community bonds are. And then, in Afghanistan, then after these individuals were detained, now you have drones over, these villages in Afghanistan. So the trauma of that is something that we really need to pay attention to.
So there's a quote from Sami Al-Hajj from the report. When I get my release after 7 years, the first child I saw was my son. At that time, he was 8 or 9. I leave him baby and found him as 9 years. The first one I saw in the hospital when they returned me back. In the hospital. The child is my son, Mohammed. We didn't see my child. We didn't see family, just letter from them. And even that letters, they put crossing, censoring some words. That just, subhanAllah, for a crime that you did not do, for you don't even know what crime you're being charged with,
Yeah,
sold. And many governments were complicit in this as
absolutely.
well. The Pakistani government was definitely complicit, the Saudi government, the Yemeni government at that time. These men were just handed over as bounty to the agreement with the American guy. You're playing. You're being a partner in this war on terror that was unleashed throughout the world. Rather, the war of terror. And one other thing that fascinated me about this too, that so many of them were just in their 20s, early mid 20s, time where you're looking forward to getting married or studying, or even if you're in the village, maybe perhaps now being inheriting your own piece of land to farm. Uh, just the prime, of your life, and subhanallah, to spend 40 years in a place like that. And there was some over the age of 70 as well.
Yes, the oldest, as I had mentioned, was 89. 89. I cannot, that I cannot imagine. And I mean, I don't know, don't remember too much, and not that the government documents would say this, but I wonder if he had ever been on a plane before. So
Mm.
imagine being 89 and these individuals were blindfolded. They couldn't, they had sensory blockers, so they couldn't hear anything, they couldn't see anything. and then being put on a plane and halfway across the world, you end up on this island in a prison, not speaking the language. Just
Possibly never having seen a white person or a black person before. Possibly, like if you were.
absolutely, absolutely. And you had mentioned Samuel Hudge's quote about letters and redactions, and I think that's one other thing we really need to point out is that in Guantanamo, everything it's opaque.
Mm-hmm.
So the government has access to all the detainees if they write anything, if they draw anything, and the government chooses whether or not that can be shown. So I had mentioned the Guantanamo Diaries by Mohamedou Salahi. It was only published after the government like looked at it, and if you have the book, there are pages and pages that have been redacted. This is again, this is information, and this is probably incriminating information that the government doesn't want released.
And nobody is going to be held accountable, and that is just what is so egregious about all of this. And when you were talking about the mental health status of these, and a good friend of mine, Dr. Mahan, you've quoted her in the report as well. She's a mental health counselor. A lot of people don't know that about her. That her master's degree is in mental health, and that her PhD was on torture. And she's like the antithesis to the James Wilson, I believe, the psychiatrist.
The Mitchell, yeah. Yes.
And we should, blast their names out. These people are criminal for what they have done. But here, Dr. Mahat says in your report, in the case of Guantanamo, some doctors have played a role in the government's torture apparatus. Others are employed by the same government that ordered incarcerated people's torture in the first place. Even if that's not the case, there is the argument that the consequences of having psychologists attend to the incarcerated people's risks providing ethical cover to an illegal detention site where detainees are still being tortured with painful force feeding, solitary confinement, and hopelessness induced by indefinite detention without charges. And that's the worst part about it, the indefinite detention. You don't even know, okay, when you're regularly incarcerated, perhaps, okay, I have a 10-year sentence to serve, I have a 20-year sentence to serve, but indefinite, like how could you have hope except for those that really do talk about their hope in God, a faith in God, and that's what they brought them hope, subhanAllah. When you were looking at, what were some of the techniques? And I know that they had the force feeding, and those are some of the. But there were others, other techniques that psychologists used. Let's focus a little bit more on those.
The waterboarding was one of the prime techniques, and they actually tested it on Abu Zubaydah. And Abu Zubaydah is still in Guantanamo. He's one of those in indefinite, detention. They waterboarded him a total of 83 times. And for those of you who don't know what waterboarding is, essentially they lay you down, they put a towel over your face, they've shackled you, and then they're just dumping water on you. So it's drowning. And they do it to the point where there are doctors in the room. So again, I want to highlight what Dr. Hilal said. Health professionals are very much so involved in what's going on in Guantanamo and what happened in Guantanamo. There were doctors there who would check the pulse to make sure to just get you to that point of where you could die, and then they would stop. Abu Zubaydah, actually, if you, for the viewers, if they look him up, he drew images of his torture. So he recalled how he was tortured, and he drew. And these are just really powerful. And there's one where they've strung him up from the ceiling by his wrists, and he has I don't know if it's a bullet wound in his leg, but he has an open wound in his leg. So they've hung him from the ceiling. He has a wound on his leg, and most of the time they did this, they were naked. So there was that harassment. They would put them in cold rooms, really, really cold rooms. blast really loud music. So sleep deprivation was a tactic that was used all the time, putting them into very small confined spaces, sometimes putting them in coffins. Sometimes saying, in the black sites, I know that there were reports where they would say, if you don't confess or if you don't say that you did this, we have your wife here and someone's going to rape her. These were the threats that were made to them. And then I also wanted to say with, you had mentioned someone's quote before. You had mentioned, now I've lost my train of thought, but it was something along the lines of the medical professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So when the force feeding happens as well, that was done by medical professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So we really need to talk about the ethical implications of, they took their Hippocratic oath. And what happened at Guantanamo and what continues to happen is a violation of that Hippocratic oath. So, and as you had mentioned, James Mitchell and it was Bruce Jensen is the other psychologist. They made millions from this program.
Yeah, 81 million, right?
They had contracts with the government, and at these black sites, they provided the interrogators. And then going back to Abu Zubaydah, he was actually captured in 2002, but he didn't arrive at Guantanamo until 2006. So for 4 years, he was flown around to different black sites around the world where he was tortured. And there are reports that some of the early, I guess you could call trainee interrogators, practiced their techniques on him. He was almost, as you could say, a guinea pig for their torture tactics. Sorry, go ahead.
And even with these torture tactics, like there would be other mental health professionals there to supposedly like at least bring them back from like the brink of, if they were having an episode. But even they were so primed ahead of time to hate the people that they were going to be serving, that and be made to feel scared of them.
Yes.
That was an aspect that I was especially fascinated by. That if you're going to go in and serve somebody, but you are being told that be careful, they could come after you. Their friends or whatever their cohorts will come after your family. Mm-hmm. How will you be able to go there and serve anybody with any sort of integrity? So
Absolutely.
that is.
And I think to go off of that, if for those of us who remember, right after 9/11, we remember the language in the media. We remember the language being used by the politicians. And it was, overwhelmingly these men are terrorists. They were involved somehow in 9/11. They're just the imagery that was conjured up by the public. Mm-hmm. When it comes to media, politicians, academics were involved in this. Really painted these individuals as being not human, like you said, it dehumanized them. So if that's all you've been fed, and then say you're someone who's now stationed at Guantanamo, mm-hmm. that's what you're going to believe. But I would also think that there's some sort of human soul where you just, personally, I just don't understand how someone could do that. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to also highlight, you had mentioned the mental health aspect. We documented from the Joint Task Force documents that about 12% of the detainees had been diagnosed. But we want to note that, the people who are diagnosing these individuals are part of the government. So mm-hmm. we need to take that into account of how accurate it is. And also point out, so there have been 9 deaths in Guantanamo. I don't think many of the people know that. And I believe 7 of those were allegedly death by suicide. We also, again, this is the government's narrative. We don't know the truth. We don't know what really happened. As I've told you about the torture, people in black sites around the world, and there are reports in Bagram in Afghanistan, which was one of the prisons where they were taken to before they came to Guantanamo. There were people who died there because of the torture that the U.S. had inflicted. And a lot of I want to mention why there were black sites is because they functioned outside of the U.S. legal system. So torture in some countries and using these methods, the U.S. was protecting itself essentially. There were black sites reportedly in, I believe, Romania. In the UAE, there was a black site. In Thailand, there was a black site. So Guantanamo may just be in the U.S., but the larger apparatus behind it is global. A lot of other countries were involved as well. These men were taken on planes. So, there's international element to it that we should also remember.
Exactly. And then, and as you were talking about repatriation, which country has been most welcoming of some of their nationals to come back, and which ones have totally just denied entry?
So a lot of them have been repatriated to Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, UAE. A lot of individuals who were from Yemen weren't able to go back due to the instability and due to the ongoing war. But we want to highlight that when they have been, say, accepted by the UAE has put them back in prison. So we want to note that just because they've been repatriated out of Guantanamo doesn't technically mean they're free. There was recently an online event featuring a former detainee at Guantanamo, a Uyghur individual, who was repatriated to Bermuda. And that was one of the only few countries that would accept him because China had told any other country that if you accept this individual, it would affect our trade agreements. So a lot of countries don't want to take in these individuals because of, again, politics, essentially. And then like I mentioned with Yemen, they just can't return because of the instability, the ongoing, war that's happening in the country.
And some of them have been placed in countries like Serbia.
Yeah. So can you imagine if, say, you're someone from Afghanistan and you end up in Serbia and you don't know anyone, you don't know the language? I don't believe that Guantanamo provides you with any support after they just drop you off there. And like I said, oftentimes they don't have passports, so you're essentially stateless. A lot of times it's organizations on the ground that are helping these individuals. As I mentioned, Mohamedou Salah, he's in Mauritania. He's from Mauritania. His wife is in Germany, and he had a baby, so they have a 2-year-old. But he can't be with his family because he can't get access to his passport. So these individuals, that's another thing we want to highlight, is just because you have been released from Guantanamo does not mean that you are quote unquote free. And there have been individuals who have been sent to Albania, that, Uruguay, just countries you just can't imagine someone, if they were picked up from a village in Afghanistan.
Can you tell me more about, I remember Senegal had taken some detainees back. I can't remember the exact country that they had been, perhaps Libya. Can you tell me what happened?
I don't recall that one, actually.
Okay. So yeah, I think there had been, again, there had been some resettlement agreements between a few different countries, which fell apart because a lot of countries also face backlash if they do take them in, and people are really scared because the boogeyman is now in my country, in my backyard.
And that brings me, I think, another point that I want to make is, the pandemic has also affected the trials. So we're still in pre-trial hearings. The military commission system is basically a judicial legal system that was set up just from Guantanamo, created by under President Bush to try foreign terrorism suspects. And they're not fair at all. They're painfully slow. We are now at our fourth judge to preside over because the previous judges have either retired or just moved to something else. So it starts the thing over again. And so with the pandemic, I also want to note most recently, and this is an element of the consequences of the dehumanization, is there were announcements that they were going to give the vaccine to the prisoners as well. And there was a backlash, especially, among right-wing media, among politicians, of why are you giving these individuals vaccines, which is absolutely absurd if you think about it. It's protecting everyone. If you actually want to tackle the virus, everyone needs to be vaccinated. But the government has actually halted it now. We don't have information of how many individuals. There have been infections of COVID on the island, on Guantanamo, but we don't know if any of the prisoners have it. And another point I want to highlight is many of these men are getting old. They're approaching their 70s, 60s, and they have medical conditions due to the torture and due to everything they've been through. Recently, the Pentagon asked for over $88 million to basically set up a hospice and a long-term facility for aging population. So the Pentagon has no intention of closing this facility. So it's up to the executive department to shut it down. But they're preparing basically a geriatric hospice palliative care system for these men who are aging in a prison. They have been there, it's been open for 19 years. So you can only imagine how much you change over, almost 2 decades.
2 decades. And I wanted to take a minute for all of you. You had mentioned that there were men who, there have been at least 9 Muslims who have died in Guantanamo. And just a minute for those of us watching and those of us listening to recite their names and to give them their names in front of me, and I want to recite them and just making dua for them, because God knows if their families even know if they're dead or alive, what hopes, what dreams they may have had. They were never accused of anything, so we don't even know if they were guilty of anything. So for these innocent men who perhaps passed away and who have passed away in Guantanamo, Adnan Farhan Abdul Latif, Ali Abdullah Ahmed, Abdul Rahman Maad Thafir Al Amri, Awal Gul, Muhammad Ahmed Abdullah Saleh Al Hanashi, Abdul Razak Hikmati, Inayatullah, Manaj Shammam Al-Bardi Al-Tabi, Yasir Talal Al-Zahrani, and the youngest Yasir Talal Al-Zahrani, who was 21 years old, and the eldest Abdul Razak Hikmati, who was 69 years old. May Allah grant forgive their sins, and Inna Lillahi wa Inna Ilayhi Raji'un. This is thank you for doing this work, Mubashira. It's not easy work. It takes a toll on your heart. It takes, every day to read this and to process it. But thank you so much to the Bridge Initiative. And, folks, we're putting down the link over here. Do read the report, share it. And to your team who's put this work together, thank you to all of them as well. This is something that the American government, American people have to take a look at this thing and make efforts to join the various voices in asking to shut down this. I know Amnesty has a petition out, I believe they issued it yesterday, again, asking for the shutdown of Guantanamo. So we'll share that in comments. But to sign the petition, pressure President Biden. If there's anything else that you'd like to share, Mubashir, on what people can do to get this place shut down.
I think, calling your local politicians, asking them to, put pressure on the government. Congress needs to, there's more room, I think, now, especially after Trump, to recognizing the injustices that are happening. Of course, fundamentally at the root of it is to be aware of what is happening. So do check out the resource, share it. bring awareness to it. Guantanamo has been, I think a lot of people have forgotten that Guantanamo still exists. It's still there. There's 40 men that are still there, and we need to continue raising our voices and calling attention to what's happening.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and to all of you, keep watching. We try, and if you have suggestions for any show ideas, please drop us a line at media@justiceforall.org. And thank you to my wonderful producers today, Abdul Wahid and Miriam Tisdale, for being here with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay.